Hope is the cruelest thing you can give a child, Lady Serapha Viral had once said, her voice steady as polished glass, unless you are prepared to carry it when it breaks. 3 years earlier, the sky above the Pacific Trade Corridor had been a sheet of silver clouds when the shuttle's guidance system failed. There had been no explosion, no firestorm, just a violent shudder, a scream of metal under stress, and then silence broken by the thin whine of emergency beacons. When the hatch was forced open, 12-year-old Lyra Viral lay motionless against the restraint webbing, her small sapphire hands still clenched around a data slate, her silver hair floating in the recycled air like a halo. The doctors on Earth said her spinal pathways had been damaged beyond conventional repair. The specialists from Proxima said the same, only with better lighting and a higher bill. Serapha, whose companies moved trillions of credits across 17 systems and measured profit margins the way humans measured rainfall in inches, discovered that wealth could not purchase a single step. The Viral estate rose above the cliffs north of San Diego like a sculpture of blue glass and brushed steel, its terraces stretching nearly half a mile along the ridge, security drones humming at exactly 12 feet above the marble driveway. On the morning Daniel Carter arrived, the Pacific wind carried salt through the open gates and tugged at his navy blazer, as if reconsidering whether he belonged there. At 34, Daniel had the kind of face that blended easily into a crowd. Brown hair cut short, clear gray eyes, 5'11" in worn leather shoes. But there was a steadiness in the way he walked up that quarter-mile drive, contract folder tucked under his arm, that didn't match the word assistant printed on the paperwork. He had spent years studying neurobiomechanics before funding dried up and grants vanished. Now he was a live-in support specialist for a girl most of the galaxy had quietly given up on. Inside, the foyer ceiling arched 40 feet overhead, sunlight refracting through alien crystal panels and scattering pale blue reflections across the polished floor. Lyra waited near the panoramic window in a hovering chair no thicker than 3 inches, its anti-grav emitters whispering softly. Her skin was a lighter shade of blue than her mother's, almost periwinkle, and when she looked at Daniel, there was no self-pity in her gaze, only calculation. "You're the human they hired," she said, her voice musical but precise. Daniel set his folder down on a glass console and offered a small nod. "Daniel Carter," he replied. "And you're Lyra Viral, the smartest engineer in this house." One corner of her mouth lifted. "That's debatable." "Good," he said, glancing at the exoskeleton frame resting beside her chair, its carbon lattice gleaming under recessed lights. "I like a challenge." From the mezzanine above, Serapha watched in silence, her sapphire skin catching the light like deep ocean water, her posture flawless, controlled, unbreakable. She had heard optimism before. She had seen specialists arrive with confident smiles and leave with quiet apologies. As Daniel knelt beside the exoskeleton and ran his fingers lightly over the neural interface ports, not yet changing anything, only listening to the faint electric hum, Serapha felt something she had sworn never to allow again. Not belief, not yet, but the faint, dangerous echo of possibility. The exoskeleton weighed less than 40 pounds, but when Daniel lifted it onto the work table it sounded heavier, the carbon lattice settling with a hollow click that echoed across the glass walls. He crouched beside it, sleeves rolled to his elbows, studying the neural interface array as if it were a language written slightly out of order. Lyra watched from her chair, hovering 3 feet away, her silver hair drifting in the filtered air. "They calibrated it to human baselines," Daniel said quietly, tracing the thin filaments that connected the spinal brace to the processor hub. "Your neural signals travel along similar pathways, but the amplitude is different. They tried to translate you instead of listening to you." Lyra tilted her head. "I told them that." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I believe you did." Above them, on the mezzanine, Lady Serapha descended the staircase with measured steps, the sound of her heels precise against the marble. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone cool but not unkind. "Every leading specialist on 3 worlds has evaluated that device. I assume you do not intend to contradict them within your first hour of employment." Daniel did not look up immediately. He adjusted a dial by less than a quarter inch, then powered the system down before answering. "I do not intend to contradict anyone," he said. "I intend to test a different assumption." Serapha folded her hands in front of her, sapphire skin luminous in the afternoon light. And what assumption is that? That the safest setting is the lowest setting, Daniel replied. Sometimes the system is not failing because it is weak. Sometimes it is failing because it is restrained. Silence settled between them, broken only by the faint hum of the estate's environmental controls. Lyra's fingers tightened slightly on the armrests of her chair. He is right about one thing, she said, her voice steady. They were afraid of overloading the interface. Serapha's gaze softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again. And if you are wrong? She asked Daniel. If you increase the output and her body cannot adapt? Daniel stood, meeting her eyes without defiance, without arrogance. Then we stop immediately, he said. No heroics. No dramatic risks. I will monitor every signal in real time. Heart rate, neural feedback, muscle response. We move in increments. Inches, not miles. He gestured toward the panoramic window where the Pacific stretched to the horizon. Rehabilitation is like teaching someone to trust the ground again. You do not push them off a cliff. You let them feel the floor. Serapha studied him, searching for the telltale signs she had learned to recognize in ambitious men. The hunger for recognition, the thrill of being the one who succeeded where others failed. She found none. Only focus. Only patience. One session, she said at last. Under my supervision. Daniel nodded once. That is all I am asking. He knelt beside Lyra's chair and began securing the exoskeleton around her slender frame, tightening each brace carefully, leaving room for circulation, for comfort. The device powered on with a low, steady tone, indicators glowing soft blue instead of the usual clinical white. Lyra inhaled slowly. What do I do? She asked. Daniel adjusted the interface pad at the base of her neck by less than half an inch. You do not force anything, he said gently. You think about standing, not walking, just standing. And if it feels wrong, you tell me immediately. The motors engaged with a quiet whir, lifting her a fraction of an inch from the chair. Daniel's eyes flicked between the data readouts and her face, watching for strain, for fear. On the staircase, Serapha did not move, but her hands tightened almost imperceptibly. For the first time in 3 years, the room felt different, not louder, not brighter, but charged with something fragile and dangerous. Not belief. Not yet. But motion. The motors hummed softly, a low mechanical whisper that seemed almost cautious as the exoskeleton carried more of Lyra's weight. Daniel kept one hand hovering an inch from her elbow, not touching, just present, while his other hand scrolled through columns of data projected across his tablet. Neural feedback fluctuated in narrow bands, heart rate steady, muscle fibers responding in faint but measurable pulses. Do you feel pressure? He asked evenly. Lyra's brow furrowed, silver strands drifting across her cheek. Yes, she said after a moment. But it is not pain. It is like static. Like my legs are remembering something. Daniel nodded slightly. That is good. We want memory, not strain. The exoskeleton lifted her another inch. Her feet, encased in lightweight braces, pressed against the polished marble floor for the first time in years. The contact was almost ceremonial. Sunlight spilled through the glass panels and caught on the metallic struts along her calves, scattering reflections across the ceiling. On the staircase, Serapha felt the air leave her lungs slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter the moment. That is enough, she said instinctively, one step forward. Daniel did not look away from Lyra. We are still within safe parameters, he replied calmly. But if you want me to stop, I will. Lyra's fingers tightened around the side supports. Do not stop, she said, her voice thin but determined. The processors adjusted in micro increments, increasing signal strength by less than 2%. Daniel watched the waveform patterns ripple across the display, searching for spikes, for instability. Instead, he saw something else. The dormant pathways were lighting up in sequence, not chaotically, but in rhythm. Lyra, he said gently, I want you to think about straightening your knees. Not locking them, just straightening. She inhaled slowly, eyes fixed on a point beyond the glass wall, where the Pacific stretched in endless blue. The servos responded, and her legs extended another fraction of an inch. The movement was small, barely noticeable to anyone not measuring it in millimeters, but it was hers. A faint tremor passed through the frame as muscle fibers attempted to engage on their own. The system compensated, redistributing load, preventing collapse. Daniel stepped closer, ready to support her if needed, but he did not take over. You are doing this, he murmured. The machine is only assisting. Serapha descended the last step without realizing she had moved. She stood less than 6 feet away now, close enough to hear the slight hitch in her daughter's breathing. Lyra, she said softly, the steel gone from her voice, replaced by something far more fragile. You may rest. Lyra swallowed and shook her head. Not yet. For 3 years, the word rest had meant surrender. Daniel adjusted one final setting, raising the neural threshold by a margin so small it would not register to anyone unfamiliar with the interface. All right, he said quietly. On my count. 1, 2, 3. The exoskeleton shifted its balance algorithm, transferring more control to her own signals. For a suspended heartbeat, nothing happened. Then her posture changed. It was subtle, a straightening of her spine, a lifting of her chin. The servos did not pull her upright. She met them halfway. The data stream steadied into a pattern Daniel had only seen in theory. Independent engagement. Partial, fragile, but real. Lyra was not fully standing yet. Not completely unsupported. But she was no longer simply being lifted. She was participating. In the silent expanse of the glass-walled estate, with the ocean stretching mile after mile beyond the cliff, the distance between impossible and possible narrowed to less than an inch. And for the first time since the shuttle incident, Serapha did not feel fear first. She felt awe. Lyra's legs trembled as the exoskeleton redistributed its load, the faint vibration traveling up through the carbon frame like the hum of distant power lines. Daniel watched the numbers cascade down his display in steady columns. Oxygen levels stable, neural latency decreasing by microseconds at a time. You are doing more of the work now, he said softly. The system is only catching you if you slip. Lyra's jaw tightened with concentration, her periwinkle skin glowing under the filtered California sunlight. The Pacific shimmered beyond the glass, waves rolling in long, patient lines against the cliffs nearly 200 feet below. I feel it, she whispered. It is like the signals are slower, but louder. Daniel adjusted the stabilizer by less than 1%. That is your body negotiating with the machine, he replied. It has been silent for 3 years. It needs time to remember how to speak. Serapha stood close enough now to see. The minute shifts in her daughter's posture, the way Lyra's shoulders drew back on their own rather than being positioned by servo correction. The estate was silent except for the faint mechanical whir and the distant crash of waves carried up from the shoreline. Mr. Carter, Serapha said, her voice lower than before. How long can she maintain this? Daniel glanced at the endurance metrics. At this output, perhaps 30 seconds before fatigue sets in, he answered honestly. But endurance is not the goal today. Recognition is. Lyra swallowed and focused on the horizon. Daniel saw it before the sensors did. A fractional shift in balance, weight transferring unevenly to her right side. The exoskeleton compensated instantly, but he raised his hand. All right, he said gently. Ease back. Slowly. Lyra shook her head once, a stubborn flash in her violet eyes. I want to try something, she said. Daniel hesitated only a second. Tell me first. I want to move my left foot. The words hung in the air like a fragile equation. Serapha's breath caught, but she did not interrupt. Daniel scanned the interface. The brace will guide the arc, he explained. But the initiation must come from you. Think about shifting weight to your right leg. Just a little. Half an inch. Lyra inhaled through her nose and exhaled slowly. The exoskeleton recalibrated, transferring marginal load. Daniel's screen flickered as new neural patterns spiked along the left channel. There, he murmured. Hold that. For a suspended second, nothing changed. Then the toe of her left brace scraped forward across the marble by less than an inch. It was not a step in the traditional sense. It was a slide, barely measurable without instrumentation. But it was deliberate. The motor did not initiate it. The signal came first. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the data. You moved it, he said quietly. Lyra blinked, almost startled. Did I? Daniel turned the tablet, so she could see the waveform peaks aligned with the motion timestamp. That is yours, he said. Not the machine. Serapha pressed her hand lightly against her own collarbone, as if steadying herself. The estate, with its sweeping terraces and multi-million-dollar art installations, had never felt so small, so intimate. Lyra's left foot settled back into alignment, the exoskeleton stabilizing her posture as fatigue began to creep into her muscles. Daniel nodded. "That is enough for today," he said gently. "We stop while your body still remembers success." Lyra allowed the system to lower her gradually, inch by careful inch, until she hovered just above the chair. When her weight finally transferred back, the servos powering down to a soft blue glow, she looked up at her mother with something that had been absent for years. Not defiance, not resignation, but possibility. And in that quiet, sunlit room overlooking miles of open ocean, Serapha understood that what she had just witnessed was not a miracle. It was a beginning. The sun had shifted west by the time Daniel powered the exoskeleton down completely, the ocean outside turning a deeper shade of blue as late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the marble floor. Lyra rested back in her hovering chair, not slumped in exhaustion but upright, alert, replaying the movement in her mind as if afraid it might vanish if she stopped thinking about it. Daniel detached the neural interface carefully, checking for irritation along the contact points at the base of her neck. "Any discomfort?" he asked. Lyra flexed her fingers experimentally. "Only tired," she admitted. "But it is a good tired." Daniel nodded. "That means your muscles participated. That is progress." He carried the exoskeleton frame back to the work table, running a diagnostic sweep as numbers scrolled in clean, orderly lines. The left channel showed a slight delay compared to the right, less than 1/10 of a second, but measurable. He adjusted a calibration marker by a fraction, saving the change without comment. Across the room, Serapha remained still, studying both of them with an intensity that had once intimidated interplanetary negotiators. "You stopped before she reached full extension," she said at last. It was not an accusation. It was a question disguised as observation. Daniel did not look defensive. "Yes," he replied. "Success must end before failure begins." The nervous system remembers the last experience most vividly. If we had pushed until she collapsed into the chair, that would be the memory her body carried into tomorrow. Serapha absorbed that in silence. For 3 years, the experts had measured improvement in percentages and projected outcomes in quarterly reports. None had spoken about memory as something sacred. Lyra turned her chair slightly toward her mother. "It felt different," she said softly. "Not like being pulled. More like being invited." The words seemed to settle in the air between them. Daniel closed the tablet and set it aside. "Your body does not need to be forced," he said. "It needs to be trusted. We will increase endurance in small intervals. 30 seconds becomes 45. 45 becomes 1 minute. Inches become steps." He glanced toward the glass wall, where the horizon stretched nearly limitless. "We measure distance in feet and miles because we forget how powerful an inch can be." Serapha walked slowly to her daughter's side, placing a cool blue hand over Lyra's smaller one. The contact was gentle, almost tentative. "And if tomorrow she cannot repeat it?" she asked quietly. Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "Then we repeat the process," he said. "Rehabilitation is not a straight line. It is a conversation. Some days the body whispers. Some days it argues. We listen either way." Lyra's lips curved into a faint smile. "I would like to argue tomorrow," she said. A breath that might have been a laugh escaped Daniel. "Then we will be prepared." Outside, the wind picked up slightly, carrying the distant rhythm of waves against the cliffs. Inside the estate, with its expansive terraces and priceless artifacts, the most valuable shift was invisible to any scanner. It was in the way Serapha's shoulders no longer carried the rigid weight of inevitability. She looked at Daniel not as a hired assistant, not as a hopeful risk, but as someone who had given her daughter something no amount of wealth had secured. Not a cure, not yet, but direction. And direction, she was beginning to understand, was the first real step. The next morning the marine layer rolled in thick over the Pacific, turning the horizon into a pale gray blur, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Daniel was already in the atrium by 7 o'clock, the exoskeleton disassembled across the work table in precise rows, micro-tools laid out beside it like surgical instruments. He had adjusted the left channel latency overnight by less than 0.03 of a second and recalibrated the balance algorithm to respond more quickly to independent signal spikes. When Lyra entered, hovering quietly into the room, she noticed the difference immediately. "You changed something," she said, eyes narrowing with curiosity rather than suspicion. Daniel glanced up, offering a small smile. "Only what?" "Your body asked for," he replied. "Nothing dramatic." Serapha followed a moment later, dressed not in formal business attire, but in a simple ocean blue gown, her silver hair pulled back loosely. She said nothing at first, but her presence carried the same gravity as any boardroom negotiation. Daniel helped Lyra into the frame, securing each brace carefully, checking circulation, asking for confirmation at every step. "Comfort level?" he asked. "Stable," Lyra answered. The system powered on with a low tone, indicators glowing soft blue again. Daniel did not rush the sequence. He allowed the baseline readings to stabilize before initiating lift. 30 seconds yesterday, he said quietly. Today we aim for 45. Not because we must, because we can. The exoskeleton elevated her slowly, inch by deliberate inch, until her feet met the marble once more. Lyra closed her eyes briefly, focusing inward. Daniel watched the neural display, searching for the pattern he had seen before. It appeared again, faint at first, then stronger. Independent engagement along the left channel. "Shift your weight," he instructed gently. "Half an inch to the right." She obeyed, and this time the tremor that passed through her legs was shorter, less uncertain. The brace around her left foot responded to a voluntary signal rather than a corrective one. "Now think about the floor," Daniel continued. "Not the machine. The floor." Lyra inhaled, and her left foot lifted clear of the marble by nearly an inch before settling forward by 2. The sound was soft, almost inaudible, but it echoed louder than any applause could have. Daniel did not celebrate. He measured. "That was controlled," he said evenly, though his pulse quickened. "You initiated and completed the motion." Serapha stepped closer, no longer holding herself at a distance. "Lyra," she whispered. Lyra opened her eyes and looked down at her own legs as if seeing them for the first time in years. "It felt mine," she said. The timer on Daniel's tablet ticked past 40 seconds. Fatigue began to register in the muscle response curves. "All right," he said gently. "Ease back." Lyra shifted her weight again, preparing to return to the chair, when something unexpected happened. Instead of collapsing into the support field, her right leg held firm without assistance for a fraction of a second longer than programmed. The exoskeleton compensated automatically, but Daniel saw it clearly. "You held yourself," he murmured. Lyra blinked in surprise. "I did not mean to." "That is the best kind," Daniel replied softly. As the system lowered her carefully back into the chair, the marine layer outside began to thin, sunlight piercing through in narrow beams that illuminated the room in gold. Serapha looked from her daughter to the humans standing beside her and understood that what they were witnessing was no longer a test of machinery. It was a return of ownership. And ownership, she realized, could not be bought. It had to be reclaimed. By the end of the week, the estate had settled into a new rhythm, one measured not in board meetings or market reports, but in seconds held upright and inches gained across polished marble. The marine layer no longer felt heavy. Sunlight poured through the glass panels in wide bands, warming the floor beneath Lyra's braces. Daniel had increased the endurance threshold gradually, never more than 10% at a time, allowing muscle fibers to adapt instead of rebel. On the 7th morning, he adjusted the timer to 90 seconds. "We do not chase numbers," he reminded her as he secured the final clasp. "We respect them." Lyra gave a small nod, violet eyes steady. 90 seconds, she said, as if tasting the weight of it. Serapha stood nearby, tablet forgotten at her side, her attention fixed entirely on the space between her daughter's feet and the floor. The exoskeleton engaged with its familiar low hum, lifting Lyra carefully until both feet pressed firmly against the marble. Daniel monitored the neural display, watching the independent signal spikes grow stronger and more consistent. "Shift," he instructed softly. Lyra transferred her weight, with less hesitation than before. The right leg stabilized. The left responded. "Now one full step," Daniel said. The servos adjusted balance parameters, but did not initiate motion. Lyra's left foot rose nearly 2 inches, moved forward, and settled down a full 6 inches ahead of its starting point. The sound of contact was clear and unmistakable. Daniel's eyes flicked to the timer. 30 seconds. Again, Lyra whispered before he could speak. She shifted weight and brought her right foot forward to meet the left. Not a slide. A lift in place. 45 seconds. Serapha's fingers tightened around the edge of a nearby table, knuckles paling against sapphire skin. Lyra, she breathed, but there was no warning in her voice now, only awe. Daniel stayed close without touching, his presence a steady anchor. You are controlling the arc, he said. The machine is following you. 60 seconds. Lyra's breathing grew heavier, but her posture remained upright, chin lifted. She looked down at the distance she had covered, less than 2 feet across the vast expanse of marble, and it might as well have been a mile. One more, she said. Daniel glanced at the data stream. Fatigue indicators were rising, but still within safe margins. All right, he agreed quietly. One more. She shifted again, slower this time, muscles trembling under the strain, but the signal peaks were unmistakably hers. The left foot moved forward another 5 inches. The timer crossed 90 seconds. Daniel reached toward the control panel. Ease back, he said gently. Lyra hesitated, then nodded, allowing the system to guide her into a stable stance. But before it could lower her completely, something changed. Her right leg locked into place without assistance, holding her upright for a heartbeat longer than programmed. Daniel froze, eyes scanning the display. The support ratio had dropped. She was bearing more of her own weight. Lyra, he said softly, almost reverently. You are standing. Not lifted. Not guided. Standing. For 2 full seconds the exoskeleton did not carry her. It guarded her. Then Daniel reduced the output and guided her safely back into the hovering chair. The room was silent except for the software as the system powered down. Serapha stepped forward slowly, as if approaching something sacred. She knelt in front of her daughter, not as a magnate, not as a strategist, but as a mother who had just witnessed the impossible become measurable. And in that sunlit atrium overlooking miles of open ocean, the distance between hope and reality narrowed to the space of 2 steady feet on the ground. The sound that followed was small and ordinary, yet it echoed through the atrium like a declaration. Porcelain struck marble. A sharp, clean crack. Lady Serapha Viral did not even realize she had let go of the breakfast plate she had been carrying. It slipped from her hand and shattered at her feet, fragments scattering across the polished floor in a pale ring around her heels. She did not look down. She could not. 10 feet away, framed by morning light pouring through 40-foot glass panels, her daughter was standing without assistance. The exoskeleton's indicators glowed a muted blue, but the support ratio on Daniel's tablet had dropped to near 0. Lyra's legs trembled, not from mechanical vibration, but from effort. Real effort. Daniel stood half a step behind her, close enough to catch her if needed, yet deliberately not touching. Hold, he said quietly, voice steady. Just breathe. Lyra inhaled, shoulders rising. Chin lifted toward the horizon, where the Pacific stretched wide and endless. 1 second. 2. 3. The machine did not lift her. It waited. Serapha's breath left her in a silent rush as the reality settled in, not as a surge of emotion, but as a recalibration of truth. For 3 years, she had funded research facilities across 2 continents and 3 planets. She had authorized experimental therapies measured in millions of dollars. She had reviewed clinical projections and risk assessments in meticulous detail. None of them had prepared her for this simple, immeasurable moment. Lyra, she whispered, the word breaking free before she could restrain it. Lyra turned her head slightly toward her mother, and in that small shift there was balance. Not perfect, not permanent, but present. I am here, Lyra said softly. The timer on Daniel's tablet ticked past 10 seconds. He scanned the neural patterns, searching for instability. Instead, he saw coherence. Signal peaks aligned in clean, rhythmic waves. The left channel no longer lagged behind the right. You are doing this, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Lyra shifted her weight forward, tentative but intentional. The exoskeleton compensated by only a fraction, acting as guardrail rather than engine. Her right foot lifted 2 inches, moved forward nearly 8, and settled down with a clear, decisive sound. A step, not a slide, not an assisted reposition. A step. Serapha felt her knees weaken as the meaning landed fully. The plate fragments at her feet were forgotten. The market reports waiting in her office were forgotten. The negotiations scheduled for noon were irrelevant. Her daughter took another step. Smaller, slower, but unmistakably hers. Daniel reached toward the control panel, ready to intervene, but he did not reduce output. He allowed the data to speak. Support at 15%. 10. 5. Ease back, he said gently after 20 seconds that felt like an eternity. Lyra nodded, and this time when the system lowered her, it did so gradually, respectfully, as if acknowledging that it was no longer the central force in the room. When her weight settled fully into the hovering chair, silence filled the atrium. Serapha stepped forward, glass crunching softly under her shoes, and dropped to her knees in front of her daughter. She did not speak immediately. She simply placed both hands on Lyra's cheeks and pressed her forehead gently to hers. Across the sunlit marble floor, Daniel powered down the exoskeleton and set the tablet aside. He did not look triumphant. He looked relieved, because he knew what Serapha now understood. This was not a miracle delivered by wealth. It was not a breakthrough born from prestige. It was the result of inches, patience, and a human who refused to measure possibility in anything larger than hope. That evening the ocean was calm, the last light of sunset stretching in ribbons of gold and violet across the water nearly 200 feet below the terrace. The shattered porcelain had been cleared away, the marble polished again, but something fundamental in the virile estate had shifted and could not be reset. Lyra sat near the glass wall, not in the center of the room as a patient, but beside it as a participant, the exoskeleton resting quietly against the work table like a tool that had finally been understood. Daniel stood on the terrace just outside, hands resting on the cool metal railing, watching the tide move in steady rhythm. He did not need applause. He needed data, patience, and tomorrow morning. The sliding door opened softly behind him. Serapha stepped out into the evening air, the wind lifting strands of her silver hair. For a long moment she said nothing. She simply stood beside him, looking at the horizon where sky and ocean met in a seamless line. "You did not promise me a cure," she said at last, her voice no longer edged with authority, but grounded in reflection. Daniel shook his head slightly. "No, ma'am," he replied. "I promised to listen." Serapha turned to him, sapphire skin catching the fading light. "For 3 years I have purchased the finest expertise in the galaxy," she said. "I have built laboratories, funded grants, hired minds with credentials that filled entire screens. Not one of them spoke about inches." Daniel allowed himself a small, almost embarrassed smile. "Inches are measurable," he said. "Miracles are not." Inside, Lyra shifted in her chair and looked down at her legs, flexing her toes experimentally within the lightweight braces she still wore. The memory of standing lingered in her muscles like warmth after sunlight. It was no longer a distant theory. It was something her body had tasted. Serapha followed Daniel's gaze back through the glass. "She will walk again," she said softly. It was not a question. Daniel considered his words carefully. "She will continue," he answered. "And that is stronger than walking." The evening breeze carried the scent of salt and distant kelp across the terrace. Somewhere below, waves rolled against stone with patient persistence, inch by inch reshaping the shoreline. Serapha drew in a slow breath. "You asked for no bonus, no public recognition," she said. "You declined the press inquiries this afternoon." Daniel shrugged lightly. "She is not a headline," he replied. "She is a person." Silence settled between them again, but this time it was comfortable. Inside the atrium, Lyra pressed her palms against the arms of her chair and pushed upward experimentally. For a brief second, without the exoskeleton engaged, her legs tensed in response. They did not lift her fully, not yet, but they answered. Daniel saw it through the glass and felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with alignment. Serapha followed his gaze and saw it too. Her daughter was no longer waiting for rescue. She was participating in her own return. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in deep indigo. In the reflection on the glass, 3 figures stood connected not by contracts or wealth, but by something far less visible and far more enduring. In a world measured in miles of ocean and trillions of dollars, it had taken a single human to prove that the smallest unit of change was not money, nor machinery, nor even time. It was the decision to stay.